So I am very excited for you that you've got the election reform topic. I think it's going to be very good, and I think that it is categorically different from most of the team policy topics that I've seen in either of the homeschool leagues over the years because it's both finite and dense inside. It's finite because it's fundamentally about one thing. It's about a federal election. And there are different kinds of federal elections. There's the presidency, there are the election of other federal officials, but fundamentally it's that one enterprise. And even if that enterprise has a lot of moving parts to it, and believe me it does, it still gives the topic of coherence at its center. And I want to begin with that and say, because that's true, and because this topic is not like significantly reform foreign policy toward Russia or toward India, it's not one of those topics where there is one broad subject area, but you'll have zillions of affirmatives, many of which have nothing to do with each other, no overlap with each other at all. Because this topic is different, I think how you start off, if you want to be smart about it, you should start off differently. Now, I'm going to put in my quick plug for the beginning practice of sweeping the library. And I say this every year. You ought to go to the library, a good college library that you find near you. You ought to find the place in the Library of Congress system. I probably should have looked that up before I started this video. But find in the Library of Congress system where the books are shelved that are about the topic's subject matter, and then just go, book by book, look at them all. And in particular, most college libraries will put the year that they were published on the spine, so you can very quickly get to the very recent ones. And then also go to the academic journals that are in that area and look through the past 4 or 5 issues and get a sense of what's out there that's not based on your own limited understanding and your own imagination, but is based on what are people actually taking up and studying and writing about. I think that's always a good place to begin, and this year, no different from any other year. But this year, I think you want to wait a little bit longer than usual before you settle on what affirmative you want to run. I think when you have a topic like this, a smart way to handle it is to do some broad spectrum reading in the different issue areas around the topic. And so what I'm going to do in this video, I'm not going to get to very many specifics. I'm going to talk about what I think the broad issue areas are, and I'm going to have some reading suggestions along the way, and I'm going to hint at a few wrinkles that I think might show up in each of these issue areas. But I'm not going to have much by the way of specific strategic arguments on either side. This is a strategic affirmative, this is a strategic negative approach. I'm going to save that for later on. This is just about breaking ground. But the very first thing is, we got some requests for, are there any good general reads just to find out about the basic concepts and get an overview of the topic. So we love taking requests because a lot of times, because what we do is in some ways different from what you do, when we get the helpful feedback about what would help you, that really, really gives us some guidance that we can use. So we dug around a little bit, and the first recommendation that looks really good is a textbook entitled Campaigns and Elections, Rules, Reality, Strategy, Choice. And those last 4 terms are all separated by commas. Rules, comma, reality, strategy, choice. And it's got 4 co-authors, John Sides, Darren Shaw, Matt Grossman, and Keena Lipsitz. And it's a textbook that's used in college American government classes, and it looks like it provides, we did a little skimming through it, the topics and the subheadings and the chapters. It provides really kind of comprehensive coverage, and it's aimed at introducing you to these things for the very first time. So that's something you might want to check out. A couple of other books that have been published, unfortunately all before the 2012 election, which puts them a little bit out of date, but they still look like they give some good broad coverage of areas of controversy and areas of ongoing reform. One of them is entitled Reforming the Electoral Process in America Toward More Democracy in the 21st Century, and the author is Brian L. Fife. And then another is Helping America Vote, The Limits of Election Reform, and it's from a series, Controversies in Electoral Democracy and Representation, which you might want to check out, just about every book in that series. But that book, Helping America Vote, is by Martha Kropf and David C. Kimball, and it talks about how a lot of reform efforts in the past have failed. And so that could get you sort of a first look at some of the recurring broad spectrum solvency arguments and broad spectrum institutional failure arguments that I think you'll find either pretty good inherency arguments in the first place or good negative arguments for when you don't necessarily have a case-specific hit. All right. that gets us to the 7 issue areas, and what I wanted to do is I want to start with the one that's most obvious and kind of work outward to the ones that, by the end we're going to get a little bit to the fringe, but there's still going to be live issues that I think you have to account for in being ready for the topic. The first and most straightforward issue area you'll find in electoral reform is low participation, low voter turnouts. And so what I think that when you go digging into this and you read up on a lot of the proposals for reforming elections, it'll be about clearing the way for more people to get out and vote. I mean, the logic behind having a democratically elected government is that you want people to participate. You want the citizenry to give as much informed feedback as possible. And as you go, you'll find a lot of people explaining that where government has a mandate, where there's big turnout, and where it's very clear cut and there's a lot of confidence that the people have spoken, in some ways the government operates in much more functional ways. I think you're going to find, though, that a lot of people almost take that for granted, that because if you have a kitchen knife and it's sharp, its purpose is to cut. If you have a democratically elected government and there are votes, then its purpose is for everyone's vote to count. And people treat it as though you don't have to go further in explaining why that's a good thing. And what's interesting is, if you will look into the research done by a couple of researchers by the name of Thomas Dye and Harmon Ziegler, and more recently they have a third co-author by the name of Louis Schubert, they have a book entitled The Irony of Democracy, An Uncommon Introduction to American Politics. Now, it's a textbook, just like the Sides, Shaw, Grossman, and Lipsitz book, and it's used in a number of government classes across the country. But the interesting thing about it is it's also an old debate argument. If I go all the way back in my memory to when I was first starting out, this book, the Dye, Ziegler, and Schubert book is in its 13th edition. And if I go all the way back to when I started debating, this was a generic disadvantage that you heard a lot of the time, the elite's disadvantage, because the argument they make in their book is that really elections are decided by that small core group of people who are engaged, who really study the issues, and who pay attention, and that's the way it should be. And that any interference that gets more people out to the polls actually makes the system work in irrational ways, because most people, this is the argument Dye and Ziegler make, and you might find that you have a lot of judges that are sympathetic to this argument. Most people, through the routines of their everyday lives, are far too ignorant. They have unbelievably silly, unbelievably irrational ideas about how government works. So if you reform elections to lower the barriers to participation, to encourage more people to get out to the polls, you actually make things work a lot worse. Which means, along the way researching their affirmatives, a lot of the people you compete against this year, they are going to find an impact card here, an impact card there, talking about how it's a really good thing for more people to vote, it's how democracy is supposed to work in the first place. But you can take these arguments that Dye and Ziegler make in their book, and you can impact turn that. And you can say more participation is actually bad, and it'll result in very irrational decisions. And I have to admit, it's far enough back. I mean, I was 13 or 14 when we were running this argument, and I'm in my 40s now, so I don't remember even how we impacted it. It seems to me that there were some arguments in their book about even military intervention, that when you get the kind of flawed feedback from high voter participation, you make bad decisions in foreign policy that are very dangerous. So you could impact turn that argument in some pretty interesting ways. There are a couple of other readings that we kind of stumbled across. Brian Kaplan, The Myth of the Rational Voter, Why Democracies Choose Bad Policies, is kind of in that vein as well. And then, to take a step back, if you look, there's a website, nonvotersinamerica.com, there's a professor at Northwestern University who's put together a lot of work she did on a grant in the wake of the 2000 election to try to explain what are the causes of low voter turnout, low voter participation. And she's got links to a lot of other studies, a lot of other resources, so it's a good place for you to begin if you want to do some reading about voter turnout. That's someplace that you might want to start your search and see where it takes you. Okay, second area. Second area is campaign finance. The fact that money has taken over politics, and that what people in a lot of offices have to do, especially if you're in the House of Representatives where you have only a 2-year term, the afternoon of your election you probably have to get on the phone and you have to call up some of your donors and do some fundraising. And they have to spend hours every week engaged in activities that are going to bring money into the war chest so that they can get elected. And there was a model that the way it ought to work is, yes, you have to carry on a political campaign, but once you're elected, you should be able to settle down to govern until your term is almost up, and then you go out and campaign again. But the reality with the price tag on political campaigns having gone up so high is that the campaign never ends. You're carrying on the campaign the entire time you're in office. It's definitely true for people in the House of Representatives. Increasingly, it's said to be true of people in the Senate who serve 6-year terms. So, along with that issue, you also get into lobbying, you also get into donors who have deep pockets. Does the role of money in the funding of elections, does that mean that wealthy interests have a louder voice and that they can tilt a lot of decisions their way, and that interests that aren't as well funded, they're simply not factored into the making of legislation, the passing of government rules, and so forth. But then along the way, there's also the argument that restrictions on campaign finance may be restrictions on free speech, and that people who can go out and compete in the marketplace and can fundraise and can be persuasive enough that people will contribute, that they should be able to be a louder voice. And so that's an argument that I think really you'll be able to, as you get into the research, you'll be able to go both ways. But you want to be on top of the proposals to try to rein in or regulate or deregulate how elections, and in particular campaigns, are going to be funded. I think that there are probably some good affirmatives to be written that simplify campaign finance rules, that don't take a position on money should mean more or money should mean less, but just that the rules that exist are so irrational and so hard to keep up with and so confusing that a lot of people run afoul of campaign finance rules because they aren't sure what they have to do to be in compliance, and a lot of other people figure out how to work the loopholes and really defeat some regulations that should be kind of common sense. And I tend to think that you are in a more strategic position when you're not saying, this is bad, let's decrease it, this is good, let's increase it. That's easy for a negative to get a handle on. You're in a much better position when you say, this is just crazy the way it's put together, let's sort it out and streamline it. Those affirmatives have always been harder for people to debate. So you might want to look for something like that in the area of campaign finance reform. Now, one thing I got to say before I get off this topic, the idea that money is corrupting politics and the more wealthy you are, the more power you have, you want to watch for the argument that the 2012 presidential election really defeated that, or really knocked a big hole in that, because what a lot of people are saying about the way the Obama campaign defeated the Romney campaign is that the Romney campaign, in particular Jonathan Alter, came out with a book, The Center Holds. He makes this argument, and I've seen other commentators making this argument too, that the Romney campaign, what they did is they launched a Madison Avenue campaign that was about get the message out. It was about the advertising. What the Obama campaign did, and this is more of a traditional thing for the Democrats to do, their Get Out the Vote campaign got finer and finer grained because they used the data analysts who came and volunteered and in some cases were hired by the campaign to figure out how do they reach the people who are undecided in very sophisticated ways. And so you had the Koch brothers and you had Karl Rove's PAC, and they had very big war chests and they spent enormous amounts of money, and there was a lot written right after the presidential election saying these oceans of money were poured into these messages and they lost anyway. And if you go back and you get that, you cut those, then you have some pretty convincing, pretty almost close the deal arguments that money is not that big of a source of raw power. Well, it may be raw power, but it's not refined power, and it doesn't necessarily determine outcomes. So if I were you, if you want to be ready to debate the whole campaign finance issue, go back and get some of those articles that do the post-mortem on the 2012 presidential election, because they make that argument in pretty stark terms. I think you'd find some really good evidence there. All right, so it's two issues out of the way, participation in campaign finance. The third, there are two issues that I kind of think of as the mirror image of one another. They're symbiotic with one another, and one is voter fraud, and one is turnout suppression. On the one hand, there are claims that we need more security surrounding Election Day, and we need people to show photo ID because there are cases of voter fraud. And I may step on some people's toes, given what their politics are. Too bad. You go and you do the research on the alleged cases of voter fraud, you're going to find that they are statistically insignificant. You're going to find that there are fewer than would be suggested given the number of people who are voting. I mean, it's been said before that Voter ID is really a solution in search of a problem, and nobody's ever been able to provide really convincing data to back the claim that the problem exists. Yes, occasionally there are people who come and don't comply, but there's not enough to rationally justify any major restrictions. Yes, there are people who park in the wrong parking space, but that doesn't mean you roll the tanks into downtown and start shooting the cars off the streets, because so few do it that really it doesn't make a difference in people's safety. It doesn't make a difference in the proper and orderly functioning or the proper and orderly running of the city. And the same thing, if you dig in, the same thing I think you're going to find, I'm confident you're going to find is true about voter fraud. Now, it is the case that there are proposals to try to rein in voter fraud, to try to address voter fraud, and what those are doing is those are suppressing turnouts. And as you dig into the merits of those proposals, really the research goes very much one way. And that research says that things that sound innocuous, like having a photo ID, requiring the showing of photo ID, that there are lots of unexpected consequences. And really what that does is that means certain demographic groups, and you might think they're all racial, but really they aren't, certain demographic groups will be discouraged. They'll be kept at home, and then the profile you get of who does turn out to vote is very favorable to one party or another. So that's an issue area that a lot is being written about. There are a lot of proposals, and you may find that you encounter affirmatives over the course of the year that advocate maybe a nationwide standard for photo ID. I think that's an affirmative that's not going to hold up very well, because I think there's going to be extremely good evidence and very easy to explain arguments why that's a bad idea. On the other hand, I think you might find that there are proposals to try to act against voter turnout suppression, and particularly the Supreme Court decision that at this point is only about 3 days old that threw out the pre-clearance part of the Voting Rights Act. I don't know what to think about the possibility that an affirmative that repairs that tries to rewrite the statute so that it would pass constitutional muster with the Supreme Court, I can't really get a feel on how viable an affirmative that would be, but that affirmative would fit within this issue area because it was tactics like those, it was the poll tax, it was literacy tests, things like that they were framed as ways of preserving the integrity of the ballot and making sure that people didn't vote who shouldn't. But the Supreme Court back in the 1960s struck those down, saying really what they were transparent ways to keep people from voting that you didn't want voting. So I think that issue is rerunning itself, and the Supreme Court decision taking out the safeguard of the preclearance provision of the Voting Rights Act, the answer to the question of what now, that's going to be an area for affirmatives. And that's something that you want to read up on, and you want to see what proposals are floating around there. Okay, so participation, campaign finance, then fraud and or turnout suppression. The fourth, this I think, this is where I would, if I were debating this topic, I would already be excited about debating this, and this is hyperpartisanship. Hyperpartisanship and partisan gridlock. And so the place it begins, I think, is with the problem of redistricting. And there are some states out of the 50 where that's done by nonpartisan commissions. I think Iowa has the simplest congressional districts I have ever seen in my life. They just have 4 chunks, and they've just sort of quartered the state. But then you look at the size and the shape and the ridiculous strategy that goes into the drawing of districts in most of the other states in the United States, and both parties are guilty. Both parties benefit from playing the game, and so they play it to the hilt because it's a way they can try to keep an edge and try to get a long-term majority in the state legislature in various states, which gives them power on the national stage. Now, there might be a little bit of a topicality question because these are laws that the states tend to make, but these are districts that involve the election of federal officials. And I think that's enough of a toehold in the door. One of the last things I'm going to talk about in this video is the question, can you only change federal law or are state law changes topical? But I think that because these are federal officials, they're congressional districts, that's probably enough to make it topical. The districting is one of the reasons that people become, what people wind up in is they wind up in districts that are reliably one political stripe or another, and when it comes time for their primary election each time, they don't want a primary opponent, so they have to commit to these positions that are very, very far, very polarized at the ends of the ideological spectrum. And then what they have to do is they have to hold on to those to maintain their defeat-proof district, which the defeat-proof district demographically has been constructed to really sort of back up that polarization, which is why you have so many people just in the past few years, the past 10 years and even 5 years, there are more and more people announcing their retirement from Congress. And what they say is, when they first came to Washington, D.C., you could go in every day and you could do your work and you could argue your side and you could argue in favor of your proposals, but you could also cross the aisle and you could compromise with people from the other party, figure out win-win solutions, and even go out to dinner with them at night and have friends who belong to the other party. And today you can't do that anymore. Because if it makes it into the papers that you've been consorting with the other party and the other party is the enemy, then that puts you at risk of being defeated for re-election. So that hyper-partisanship, where if the other side has a proposal that looks like it's going to be a good idea, it's going to do a lot of good for a lot of people, you have to defeat it anyway because you can't afford for the other side to have a win. If you go out and you research that, you're going to find that there are a lot of very big impact issue areas that are sort of being held back by hyperpartisanship. And it tends to be the kind of thing where passing the legislation would not be a short-term, feel-good, look-good on the evening news type of achievement, but instead it would be a big omnibus, a big reform program. So the day that I do this, the day that I made this video, last night the Senate just passed comprehensive immigration reform, and it doesn't look like, I don't know what's going to happen today or over the weekend or next week, but it really looks like its prospects are very poor in the House. And it looks like what a lot of people are saying about it is, in the current political climate, they can't get together, they can't put together a complex piece of legislation, they can't work their way through a lot of problems that have a lot of very confusing causes, and they cannot come up with a reform scheme that can address all those different causes. The only thing they can do is pass legislation with symbolic value that the people back home see as reliably Democrat, reliably Republican, reliably conservative, hardcore bedrock conservative principles, or hardcore bedrock progressive principles. It's got to be that. It cannot be anything nuanced or sophisticated. So immigration reform is one example. You could claim that as an advantage, that if you could somehow, with your proposal, get at hyperpartisanship, then immigration reform becomes doable. Then infrastructure becomes doable. Then a space program becomes doable. Then in the middle of a crisis in international relations, the parties are less likely to undercut one another, because that's the kind of thing that is an outgrowth of hyperpartisanship. Now, I talked before in talking about turnout about how that argument could actually get impact turned. And there are, as you go digging, you will find that there are people who make the argument that partisanship is actually very, very good for the United States. And I, in just reading up on this preliminary reading, you may have already read this anecdote, but I thought this was pretty amusing. In 1950, the American Political Science Association passed a resolution asking the two political parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, to be more partisan. Because apparently, as a little bit of a hangover from World War II, they were in the process of doing so much decision-making by consensus and so much compromising and negotiating that a lot of voters were feeling very discouraged from turning out for elections, because it didn't feel like you had any choice. You could vote Republican, you could vote Democrat, but you'd never been given a choice. That they were all in collusion with one another, that there was only one program for the country, and the American Political Science Association said that's not the way our electoral system could work. Now, can you imagine them saying that today? I mean, it feels like a case of be careful what you wish for. But I think, quite possibly, if you get into that literature, it's not an argument I'd want to go for every time, but on the negative, your rhetorical line could be careful what you wish for, because the cure to hyperpartisanship might mean that there's really only one choice, that de facto there's one party, and all of the deal cutting and all of the consensus building really leaves people less well represented than before, and the decisions become even more dysfunctional. So I will say that this is the issue area where I lump in people who talk about the problems with the two-party system and They have proposals for a lot of other ways of deciding elections to where there'd be more coalitions, and it would encourage more third, fourth, and fifth parties. In reading up on that issue area, what you're doing is not only auditioning all these proposals to see what makes a good affirmative, but you're making yourself familiar with them because there's a finite set. What I think you're going to grow to love about this topic, especially if you have the opportunity to go to a lot of tournaments, is you're virtually never going to get taken by surprise. You will have seen each one of these proposals before. You will have seen, in reading about them in the literature, you'll have seen what are the best arguments against them. For your own affirmative, you'll have seen what are the best arguments against it, and then what are the best answers in the literature, and your opponent will have seen your answers too, which means it comes down to who executes more effectively throughout the debate and who gives the better last rebuttal. There's less scrambling, there's less making things up, the arguments are a lot more grounded. I think this is going to be a really good topic. Okay, low participation, campaign finance, voter fraud and or turnout suppression, and then partisanship, hyperpartisan gridlock. One last thing I almost forgot to say. One good place to begin, along with hyperpartisanship, partisan gridlock, another good search term here is endless campaign. Endless campaign. That's a complaint that's often leveled against your political opponents, that they will not settle down and govern, that they're going and trying to win the headlines every week. They're going out and trying to score points against you. And they're going out and trying to make you look bad and overcome you instead of putting the good of the people first. Endless campaign, by the way, will also bring up some writings about the whole campaign finance issue area, because it also talks about the need for you to be fundraising from the day after you're elected to the day that you go to the polls the next time. But that's a good search term too. Fifth one, modeling, international modeling. The United States is one of the longest-lived democracies. It's one of the longest-lived representative elected governments that governs by consent of the governed. We adopted that model of government back when it was just pretty much taken for granted that you either had a monarch or an emperor, or you had some single or very small group of decision makers, and the United States was a great experiment. And still today in 2013, we still have peaceful transitions of power, and nations around the world who have come to reach a consensus that that's the proper form of government, they still, by and large, look to us. And we still send out election observers, we still send out consultants, we speak with a very loud voice in encouraging the spread of that form of government. But I do have to say, we've taken some hits. And a lot of the controversy in the United States over voter suppression, over civil rights and voting rights, and then what happened in 2000. Things like that have really made our leadership position a little bit shaky. And I think that this could go a couple of directions. This could be an affirmative claim. This could be your case advantage, that by streamlining and making our administration of elections a lot more efficient, that you restore that leadership, and then you could go on to claim things like democracies don't fight one another. They do, but it's a lot less common than for countries that are not democracies to fight one another, to start aggressive wars and so forth. You could use R.J. Rummel's arguments about governments that have centralized totalitarian power are far more likely to kill their own people. There's far more likely to be genocidal, industrial, what was the term? There was, because this was part of my doctoral research, industrial killing, really mass-produced killing, that happens far more often with governments that are not democracies. And then finally, where there are difficult transitions of power, when a nation is trying to make the transition to being a representative elected government, very often where there's suspicion of irregularities or vote rigging, there'll be violence in the streets, and that often opens the ways for things like military coups. And military coups, if you can win, that there's a risk with a lot of these fledgling democracies that the military may step in to try to restore order. That's the kind of thing that can often result in regional wars, and then you can get into some fairly big impacts. So, if you on the affirmative can say that your proposal for reform would restore our leadership, you can claim all of that. I think you could also do that on the negative, though. I think you could say the United States leadership is very fragile, and depending on the affirmative, you could say that the affirmative further undercuts United States leadership, and other nations will not look to us as a model anymore. Or you could say that it restores United States leadership, and other nations will look to us as a model, and that's bad because other nations, some of the European democracies, some of the Asian democracies, have a better model. So restoring U.S. leadership is actually unfavorable. And I know these are generic disadvantages, and I know that for a lot of you, the judges you have really don't like to hear generic disadvantages. But one of the things is, this is such a cohesive subject matter area for debate that they're topic generics. They almost sound like solvency arguments. They're so close to the same subject matter as the affirmative that it really tends to be a little bit less objectionable to judges who like to hear very case-specific argumentation, because it sounds like case-specific argumentation. It's about the proper running of an election, after all. Okay, so sixth one. Sixth one is adaptation to the digital age. So there's an argument to be made, a big, broad kind of clump of arguments, that elections are a relic of a bygone age, that we have far too much information now, our news cycles are far too quick. It used to be that if you ran a campaign, you gave a speech and it made it into the newspapers, and then you could go down the road to another city and give the exact same speech because they didn't have the newspapers from the town 20 miles up the road. And it used to be, even in the 50s, 60s, 70s, if you had a bad day on the road, then that night on the 6 o'clock news, there might be a report on it, and then nothing more until the next day with the 6 o'clock news. But today, 24-hour news cycle and updates on Twitter and so forth, information moves so very rapidly that there are things that go on in political campaigns. A lot of the architecture of how the campaigns work was designed for a time when information just didn't work that quickly. Why do campaign seasons need to be so long? Why do there need to be so many weeks between an election and an inauguration? And one of the arguments, I'm kind of forecasting the seventh area here, but do there need to be elections at all? You will find that there are some futurists who say that there will come a time when every citizen can participate constructively and affirmatively in governance, and we could just have the executive branch and the career administrative officials who are professionals in their area, but we don't need to have elections and indirect representation because people who want to be involved can just log in, follow the debate over any proposal. Any citizen can bring up a proposal. If it gets a critical mass of support, it should be adopted. And because we have such fine-grained communication technology, we no longer need intermediaries. So looking at that whole issue area, that's also where you would get into electronic voting. That's also where you would get into some of the election administration issues that came up in the 2000 election and also showed up in Florida in 2012 and some other places around the country as well. So that's six. Now let me get to the seventh. The seventh one I said was fringe. We started all the way with the first one, which was turnout and participation in elections. The seventh one is just the idea that elections are bad. I kind of foreshadowed this a little bit, saying elections may be obsolete, but there are people who go further. And what's interesting about this is I think where this has the most promise, it could be an affirmative, it'd be kind of a weird affirmative, but I think it almost has the most promise as a critique. I think this could be the topic that makes critiques palatable in NCFCA. And the reason they would be palatable is it's a very libertarian critique. It is a very, it's a little bit hardcore, but in libertarian philosophy and in libertarian ideas, it's really very attractive. There are two forms that it takes. One form that it takes is to say that really government ought to be about voluntary association, that there ought to be a leader that you are drawn to, and you affiliate with that leader. And instead of having a forced choice where you've got a list of names on the ballot and it's got to be one of them, you just find a leader and you affiliate with them. And so the people who write about that model of government, they say that one of the biggest obstacles to truly understanding how government ought to work to maximize liberty, to have the necessary government for security's sake, for safety's sake, but not so much that it suppresses liberty, that really we need to get representative government out of the way, and they write explicitly about that means elections. And instead, when you find a leader that you want to follow, it's almost like joining a church. When you find a representative that you want to be your voice in government, you choose them, you affiliate with them. It's almost like having at-large representation from across the entire country. And there don't need to be elections because it can be continually updated. Now, The other form that it takes, and this one's even more extreme, is just if you do a search for anti-voting, you will find that there are a lot of libertarian authors who write at length. In particular, one of the first websites we ran across was, it's hard to spell, but it's praxeology.net. praxeology.net. And they've got a list of anti-voting resources, a list of articles where people make the argument in fairly developed form. There are also 2 books you might want to look up. One of them is entitled Attention Deficit Democracy. It's by, I think, William Bovard. And the other one is entitled Dissenting Electorates. And they both make the libertarian case that really voting is sort of this pageant of civic engagement that makes it look as though government power is us collectively exercising our will, but that's an illusion. And really what we're doing is we are being coerced into participating in a pageant, and that pageant is a legitimizing pageant, but really what we're doing is we are being tricked into being complicit in our own suppression. So you could, on the affirmative, you could say we will reform federal election laws by doing away with elections, and find out of all these authors what their proposal is, what's the institutional step that ought to take place, and what will the world look like afterward. Or, what I think is probably not that viable an argument for that many community judges, but quite possibly for alum judges, and also for some open-minded parent-coach judges, a critique that is all about the founding principle, the value that unites all of us, is an appreciation for liberty. And there's a wind blowing through American politics today. Rand Paul is getting a lot more attention. Ron Paul got a lot of attention in the 2012 election. The United States is almost ready for libertarianism. And really the next step that's got to happen for true libertarianism to take hold is we've got to get away from this idea that elections are somehow a way that we express our own political values as Americans. Because I think you could defend the argument, I don't know how true the argument is, I think probably not very, but you could conceivably win the argument that that has been a stumbling block that we need to get out of our way. And you could have brought critiques to NCFCA, and there'd be a little bit of coolness to that. Okay, last thing. And I have plenty of things I'm going to say in future videos about this topic, but the last thing I want to tuck into this one, the question of, is it only topical to change federal laws, or are any laws regarding federal elections fair game? I think it's going to be very, very hard for negatives to try to win a topicality argument that you're limited to changing federal laws. First, because that list is so short. It's several of the amendments, and then it's the Voting Rights Act, and there are only about 5 of them. And the last 2 are really, they're post the 2000 election, and they're attempts to slap Band-Aids on the problems of the 2000 election. So that list isn't even as long as it seems. I think that, first of all, in addition to making the argument you have a very cramped and repetitive topic, the other argument is this topic is written, just like last year's NCFCA topic, in the passive voice. It doesn't specify an actor. But what possible sense would it make to write the topic that way if what this ambiguous phrase about federal election laws, if that was supposed to be interpreted to refer only to federal law, meaning there's only one actor, the federal government? If you interpret it the other way, to where laws governing federal elections, some of which are state laws, if those could be changed and the states could change them, or the federal government could change those state laws by striking them down, then you simply, that makes more sense with the omission of the actor. It makes the topic as a whole more coherent. So I think what's going to happen is, as long as the laws that you're reforming are only laws that govern the election of federal officials, I think that those are all going to be topical options. Okay. That's what I would do at this point. Right now, I would go out and I would read on these issue areas. This is not all that the topic is going to be about. You never know before the season gets started what people are going to go out and discover. But I think in these 7 issue areas, I think we've managed to identify the meat of the topic. And if at this point in the season, if you read expansively, and as you get to different proposals, take note of them, become familiar with them, but put off for now the decision of what your plan is actually going to be. Something will emerge that appeals to you, that doesn't seem to have very good arguments against it, and you'll wind up with something that you're a lot happier with and something you're going to win a lot with. I think this is a great topic, and I think that you're going to have a really good year.